What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. Today, I'm back with professional angler Randy Blaukat, and he's actually going to be joining me for pretty much all these streams going forward, so I'm really excited about that. And today, we're going to be talking about how to practice for a bass fishing tournament. And Randy has over 30 years of tournament experience to kind of lean on to help us understand how to better practice for tournaments. I have a little bit of knowledge I can help as well, kind of flesh out maybe some of the electronics and offshore fishing preparation, but we're mainly going to be just picking Randy's brain tonight for as much information as we can about how to practice for tournaments, and so hopefully you guys are going to enjoy that. Randy, how's everything going tonight?
Doing good, Johnny. How's everything going there?
It's great. We actually got in the lake today. Let the viewers know how that went.
Yeah, we went out. We shot a show for Johnny's Fish the Moment YouTube channel on Table Rock today. Went out there and we basically wanted to determine whether fishing offshore deep or fishing the shallow flooded cover is better right now, because there's 12 foot 14 foot of water in the bushes right now, and it's post spawn. So anyway, it was an interesting day. It was I'll give away a little bit of it, but I got taught a lesson today by the young guns. So you guys will have to tune in next week to check it out.
Yeah, it was a fun day. It's kind of an interesting premise for a show. It's kind of the offshore fishing versus the shallow water fishing. And so Randy didn't have his graph turned on at all. And I basically only use my graphs. And so there's going to be days where one is going to be better than the other. And we're just going to keep this going over time on a lot of different lakes in different conditions, different times of year, and maybe we'll get some really good insights on maybe when you should be fishing offshore, when you should be fishing shallow, and I think that it's going to be a really cool series to help everyone learn. But we don't want to give too much away on that, but there were some cool baits and some cool techniques that came into play. You may have seen a little bit on my Instagram, a little bit of a teaser there. But so let's just jump straight into the heart of the content, which is practicing for tournaments. And practicing for tournaments can be very overwhelming because when you get to a lake, you have a ton of water that you have to try to break down. You have to try to find areas not only that have fish that maybe other competitors aren't going to be in and that are going to stay good for the tournament. And so I think when a lot of people start practicing for tournaments, it's just like almost an overload of information and possibilities. And do you remember when you started fishing tournaments, Randy, like how you started to practice, how it felt to practice, things like that?
Oh yeah, back when I started, I mean, you look back, years ago when you don't have a lot of experience as far as seasonal patterns and understanding how the fishing pressure over the course of the practice affects the fish leading up to the tournament. You tend not to take those factors into consideration, and I think one of the big mistakes I'm, looking back, reflecting, when I first started my tournament career, I think that I fished too much like for one day, like a one-day event. And I didn't really have enough water to sustain me, not only through the entire tournament, but to sustain you through the fishing pressure created from 150 to 200 other anglers, not including the recreational fish anglers that are out there. So, that right there is probably the biggest thing right there. I didn't understand the impact that fishing pressure would have over the course of a 4-day tournament.
Yeah, I think that is something that is really difficult to grasp, is understanding how to find enough water, how much water is enough water, and how do you know that you found something that's going to hold up for a tournament. And there's so many factors that go into that, and sometimes it just doesn't work out at all. And so hopefully during this live stream, and also for the podcast listeners during this podcast, we want to really break down, or I really want to pick Randy's brain on how to go about developing a good practice strategy, a good game plan, and figure out how many spots you're going to need, how to prepare for upcoming conditions, stuff like that. And so basically, Randy, I'm just going to be shotgunning a bunch of questions I have off the top of my head, stuff that I've wanted to know for a long time that I haven't really even been able to pick anyone's brain on, because most of the time I have either competitors who don't want to tell me how to practice, or the other pros who don't want to give away the secrets because that's why they're successful. So this is a really great way to, help the average angler here. So first up, when you're trying to practice for a tournament, what is your preparation before you even get to the lake? How much map study do you do? And let's just break this down. I guess let's do a couple different ways. Let's start by talking about just pre-fishing for a one-day derby. Let's say that you're just going to go out and fish a one-day tournament. We'll kind of talk about multiple-day tournaments, but for most of the viewers, they're going to be doing weekend tournaments, like a Federation Club, a BFL, stuff like that. So if you're going to practice for like a BFL, what would be your strategy before you even get to the lake to prep for that tournament?
Yeah, most of the anglers that are fishing one day tournaments, including myself when I used to do that, they're pretty familiar with the body of water that they're fishing. If they're fishing BFLs or if they're fishing a team trail, which, there's a ton of team trails all over the country, you have a little bit of a history on the body of water that you're fishing. And the key, the mentality that really you should have on a one day tournament is, what do I have to do to get 5 quality bites? Because a limited fish is not going to do any good. Usually, most of these tournaments, if you don't, unless you're fishing for points, most of the prize money is in the first, second, third place. So you have to figure out what you're going to have to do in order to catch the 5 biggest fish that you can possibly catch. And when you're fishing under that mentality in a one day tournament, it eliminates a lot of techniques. Most of the time, for example, if I was fishing a one day jackpot tournament, I used to fish a lot of jackpot tournaments on Table Rock and Grand Lake both. And, because I knew the lakes pretty well, I sort of knew what I needed to do. But, if you're fishing those one day tournaments, you have to sort of do a little bit of study about, what techniques am I going to have to focus on to catch those bigger fish? And you have to make a commitment to that. You have to commit yourself mentally, and you have to shift mentally to saying, okay, I may only get one bite every hour and a half, and that's okay, because if that bite is a 3.5 or 4 pound fish, that puts me right on track. I'm not necessarily thinking in terms of going out and going through a bunch of fish. So the first thing I'm going to determine on a one day tournament is what technique do I want to use. And here again, how you determine that depends on time of year, what's legal in your tournament or not. For example, I'll use one example. If you're fishing a one day tournament during the pre-spawn at Table Rock Lake, if you want to win that tournament, you might as well not have anything in your boat but an Alabama rig. You might as well take everything out of your boat, put on an Alabama rig, because the tournament is going to get won on that. And while 75, 80% of the people might make a check in that tournament on different techniques like jerk baits or spoons or whatever, it's going to get won on that Alabama rig. So if I'm wanting to go out and win the tournament, I'm gonna make that type of commitment, whether it be to the Alabama rig or Johnny and I are going to go to Grand Lake next week. If I was wanting to win there, I fished there a ton in June. I do nothing but throw a deep crankbait for the whole tournament. So a lot of it is making that commitment to what you think is going to produce the bigger fish.
And that's really key, I feel like. 'Cause I think a lot of people go into a practice day for a tournament with the expectation of, hey, I just want to start catching fish, period. I just want to catch something. And whenever I was practicing for a tournament, I never cared about getting really very many bites. I just wanted to get the quality bites, a 3 or 4 pounder. If I got one 3 or 4 pound bite in practice, that was enough to kind of lead me in the right direction. And I think for a lot of guys who are watching, they probably don't have maybe as much experience as you did, like on a Grand Lake or a Table Rock. And so let's say that you're just getting into tournament fishing. Maybe you don't have connections or friends that tell you, hey, on Grand Lake, throw a deep diving crankbait in the mid-lake section on structure or whatever. How would you go about trying to find a pattern or trying to find something? And do you have like maybe baits you would start with or techniques? Obviously, it's going to dictate by time of year, but maybe some general guidelines to try to catch those tournament caliber fish if you don't know what baits, what areas will produce the big ones.
Well, I'll give you guys a good example right here. We'll pull up Table Rock Lake on the map, and I'm going to show you a tournament that I won here. It was a June tournament. It was the Central Pro-Am Titleist tournament a few years ago, and this tournament was the first week of June, and I hadn't had that much tournament experience on Table Rock in June tournaments. I'd fished a ton of tournaments down there during the pre-spawn, that type of stuff, but what had happened in this tournament is, okay, this tournament was the first week of June. They paid like $12,000, $15,000 for first place, so it was a top heavy first place prize. So I really wanted to focus on winning that tournament. And this was the Titleist tournament. In other words, you had to have won a Central Pro-Am tournament in order to get in this one. So there was only like 35 or 40 anglers in the tournament, so you didn't have to worry about fishing pressure. But I'd been fishing Grand Lake a lot, like the last couple of weeks prior to this tournament, and I'd been catching them on a deep crankbait at Grand. So I said, man, I'm going to look for those same type of areas on Table Rock that I've been catching them, the big ones at Grand Deep Cranking. So I looked over the map, and the place that I found, and I'd never done this before, is I found Kings River right here, which the Kings River does not have a lot of notoriety for winning tournaments. There's a lot of fish in Kings River, but it just does not have the notoriety for winning tournaments. But what I was looking for is at Grand, I was catching these fish deep cranking out off of flats, not necessarily points, but flats. These fish, after they spawned, they were pulling out on those gravel flats in about 8 to 20 foot of water and just hanging out on flat banks. So I went up the Kings River here, and what I started doing is I started fishing anywhere that I found the opposite side of the channel. For example, like right here on this bend, right here, let me zoom in a little bit more. You've got a main lake bluff right here on this bend, and on the inside you'd have an inside flat here, and you'd be maybe a long cast away from the bank, and you'd be sitting maybe in 15 foot of water, and you could barely hit the bank on a long cast. And I started catching a few fish running these flats all through here. I just get right through here. I'd come right on the opposite side, these flats over here, and I started catching, some pretty decent fish in that particular tournament. And I hit 2 or 3 of those places. And after talking to some of the other anglers, how tough it was and the size of fish that I'd caught, and there was plenty of areas up here just like this, all over up here, I decided to make that commitment that that's all I was going to do. And I didn't even practice anymore in here. I simply went looking, for these areas that were similar. And make a long story short, wound up winning the tournament here in Kings River, first week of June, deep cranking the flats in here. So the point of what I'm talking about here is, in this particular tournament, I didn't have any local information. There was no notoriety that this ever worked on Table Rock before. It's something that I took from another lake that was happening at the same time, and I duplicated it on a similar body of water. Not that Table Rock's similar to Grand, but the way the Kings River was laid out was similar. So, and you'll notice that a lot. You'll hear anglers that get on a roll, and they'll say they're catching them on a bladed jig. Say they've gotten tuned with this bladed jig bite. They will be able to go from lake to lake over the course of like a month or two and duplicate that because they know the type of water they're looking for. So, a lot of it is just using your past knowledge of seasonal patterns, trying to gather as much information as you can, and going out and try to approach the practice with a little bit of creative mind.
That's super helpful, super great information there, Randy. And I think that is one of the keys to my early success in tournaments and just success in fishing in general, is that I always would go to the lake with no idea what's going on. No one would help me. I didn't have any family members that fished. I just basically had to go figure it out on my own. And my best teacher was the Bassmaster television show. I watch every Bassmaster television show, every FLW tour event. I watch the best of Larry Nixon. I watch Bill Dance, all these things. And what I look for are all the types of areas and the baits that these guys were catching 3 to 5 pound bass on. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know any techniques that produce good fish, but these pros are catching them, and they're showing them catching them on a crankbait or a jig or something like that. So I would just go try them on my lake. And I didn't have any basis for what I was doing when I started. I just had to kind of randomly do stuff. Well, fortunately for a lot of content out on YouTube now, especially like on my YouTube channel, I show the exact Navionics images of the spots. I show what to look for on your graph, the bait, all these different things. And that's what I like to do with my YouTube videos, is give these patterns out. And a lot of times you might think, okay, well, this technique might not really be that useful for me because I don't fish Table Rock Lake. I don't fish Grand Lake. But you will be shocked at how many times I've caught fish on lakes up in northwest Arkansas using techniques and in areas that are similar to the places I used to fish in central Arkansas. And I've taken those techniques to North Carolina, to Tennessee, to Alabama, Louisiana, all over the country, and replicated what I have been successful with in one part of the country on new lakes. And the way I learned that, again, is just watching the Bassmaster television shows and replicating what they were doing. So if worse comes to worse, you don't know what to do going into a tournament. One thing, there's actually someone who said in the comments here, before your tournament, binge watch Fish in the Moment. That's pretty, actually, decent advice, especially if you watch some of my summer videos for summer tournaments, because if I have, let's say, 15 or 20 summer videos out, probably one of the patterns that I lay out in my videos is going to be effective on that lake. Would you kind of agree with that, Randy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so much access to information, right now, whether it be, your YouTube channel or just, countless others out there that, offer that type of information. But, the thing about that is like you can absorb a lot of information, through different type of media, but ultimately you got to put your dirt time in there because there's a separation between absorbing intellectual information that you can see and hear and actually executing that when you get out on the water. And that only comes from time in the water and experience, and seeing that type of stuff work. That's why I always think it's really a good idea to try to spend as much time in the boat with somebody that's really good at a certain technique, because you can see it on like YouTube or you can see it on your channel, but when you're in the boat with somebody that knows how to do something like a specialty technique, and you can actually see how it's done and catch fish, that really builds your confidence tremendously in it.
For sure, and I think that is the big key, is taking that experience or that knowledge that you might pick up from YouTube and trying to apply it. I think one thing that people get scared of is they've never done a technique before, they've never tried a certain area or whatever, and they don't want to try it in a practice day because they're afraid that they're not going to find anything. Well, as a result, they go back to the 2 or 3 tactics that they think are their comfort tactics, whether that's flipping docks or throwing a crankbait down riprap or fishing a shaky head on bridge pilings or whatever it is. And basically they try these unique, crazy techniques for about maybe an hour, and they're like, oh man, I didn't catch anything. I now need to find some fish for my tournament. I'm going to go try to catch some fish so I get some confidence on this lake because I can catch them. And I think that is the worst approach you can take to tournament fishing and practicing for a tournament. And I feel like that's what about 85% of tournament anglers do. The reason I feel like that is a really bad approach is that if you are fishing your confidence techniques in your confidence areas during the practice period, one, you're burning up your fish, and you're probably already familiar with how to catch those fish. So even if you didn't catch a single fish in practice, you could go do that tournament day and probably be successful. Yeah. It's a lot better, in my opinion, to go do the crazy techniques and practice on stuff that you're unfamiliar with. And if you do catch fish, then you're right rolling and you're on a roll. And if you don't catch fish, worst case scenario, you just go do the things you're confident in the areas you're confident in, and you're probably going to do better because you haven't burned your fish and you have a fresh mind on it. What do you think about that, Randy?
That you hit it on the head there, Johnny. That's exactly true, because so many people, the thing you cannot do in practicing for a tournament or even fishing the tournament is you can't fish in fear. And what happens is people say, well, I got to know how many fish are on this stretch. I got to go down, I'll have my hook cut off, and I got to see how many bites I can get. But you're exactly right there, because what happens is even if you shake fish off, you're still telegraphing, you're giving that fish information, and it's still going to be a negative to the fish. The biggest key, in my opinion, one of the biggest keys in tournament fishing practice is you have to learn how to mentally pre-fish an area, just like what you're talking about. You have to be able to read the water a little bit, and you have to have the courage, for lack of a better word, not to fish the stuff that you could probably get bit in, and just say, I'm going to hit it in the tournament. And that's what I'm saying. You have to mentally pre-fish an area, because I'm a big believer that I don't want the fish. It's not that I just don't even want to hook them. I don't even want them to see the bait. I don't want them to get confident to, in tune with something that's a foreign object down there, because I believe just putting the bait around a fish, you're educating that fish to some extent. So I
Mm.
agree with you completely. Once you get a couple bites, the rest of the time just go around looking and hit those areas in the tournament, because your excitement level's higher, your confidence level going into it's higher, and just back to what you do, you're fishing the moment. You're fishing exactly what is unfolding at that day. And that is when you do the best in tournament fishing, is when you find something that's unfolding at that time and at the exact moment, not what happened the day before in practice. That's when you're a dangerous tournament angler.
And one thing that I always hear from other tournament anglers, or especially pros, they'll say, I had an awful practice period, and then they go on to win the tournament or get a top
Yeah.
five finish. Can you explain
I,
why that happens? I kind of
I,
understand why, but explain to the audience why that happens.
it's the same people all the time that say that, and I can tell you exactly what happens, because you hear guys that win practice all the time, and you hear guys that don't catch nothing in practice all the time. And what happens is the guys that are having these bad practices are just exactly what you said. They are catching a fish here, and then they're spending the next 2 or 3 hours looking for water like that and not fishing at all. And by the end of the day, they've had 2 or 3 bites, but they position themselves to have a great tournament, because they've assimilated those bits and pieces of information that they can utilize the day of the tournament, and vice versa. The same guys you hear that, I've had 25 pounds today in practice, you can pretty much guarantee that they're not going to catch them in the tournament, because if you're catching big bags of fish in tournament in practice on a regular basis, you're fishing your water way too hard in practice.
And
And,
and
and like you
also,
said, the better anglers, I mean, the marquee, super consistent anglers usually have very poor practices, or as far as numbers of fish they catch.
and the other thing too, a lot of guys, I've seen this happen so many times. And you just hear it on the Bassmasters. One example that comes to mind is it was Lake Hartwell in 2011 or 2013 or something like that, and Kevin Van Dam was fishing a striking Series 5 and a 6XD down by the dam, and there were these blueback herring that were pulling up on these points. And he was saying, man, in practice, I was catching 18 to 22 pounds of fish like crazy. And he got on this pattern in practice, and it was just happening. But by the time tournament day rolled around, and he'd fished for 3 days of practice, and then the tournament hit, that bite completely died. And a lot of times these bites, like certain patterns or techniques, they may only work for 4 or 5 days, and then the fish change. And what
Right.
happened is those fish left him. He didn't catch any fish, and he actually went and adapted and finished, like, I think, in the top 10 still, throwing a crankbait up the river. But he found these fish in practice, and he wasted one of his days trying to get those fish to bite, even though that pattern was disappearing. And I think that's what happens to a lot of guys when they're fishing tournaments is, in our practice days, they crush them in practice, and then when the tournament happens, let's say in their practice day they caught them when it was windy and cloudy. But then in the actual tournament day, it's bright bluebird skies, no wind. And like today, for example, we were on Table Rock, the bite would have been very different for both of us if instead of having bright bluebird skies and no wind, we had heavy cloud cover and maybe a little bit of rain. The
Right.
techniques, the baits, the areas, everything would be different, and we probably would have still figured out how to catch some fish just because we would adapt. But some people, let's say, catch them on a shaky head when it's sunny and calm, and then when the wind picks up and the cloud cover rolls in, they still throw the shaky head on the same points where they caught their 15 pounds of fish in practice, when other guys are just throwing a jerkbait or crankbait down the point in front of them, catching 15 pounds, and they're fishing the moment.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing about it. In practice, you can get fish that either make your tournament or break your tournament. And most of the time, those fish are the bigger fish. A lot of times, if you get on a pattern where you're catching a few quality fish, in particular, maybe you get a couple big ones in there, a lot of times that can get you chasing something that maybe happened. Conditions were just ideal at the time you caught those fish. And you can't get that out of your mind. You keep saying during the tournament, even if it's not working, man, I just need to stay with it. I just need to stay with it. I caught a 7 or 8 pounder doing this, and a lot of times that will really, really hurt you, and you'll have a terrible tournament. But on the flip side of that, a lot of times if you're catching, quality fish, and I'm always thinking in terms of big fish, quality fish. A lot of times it's a matter of making that commitment where you're not going to get that many bites, but you stay with those techniques that that can produce those big bites. I've had both type of tournaments. I've had tournaments where a big fish in practice has just killed me in the tournament, and I've had tournaments where I've done super great, because of a big bite that made me stay on a big fish pattern. So that here again, that's one of the most difficult things in tournament fishing is knowing when to stay or knowing when to leave. And if anyone figures that out 100% of the time, let me know because I don't know anybody that knows for sure.
And most of the time, it's from at least my past experience. It's always in hindsight. You can tell what you did wrong. Like, oh man, I got a 5-pounder in practice off this stretch, and I fished it 6 times in the tournament and didn't get a bite. But then you realize afterwards, oh, the current was flowing twice as much yesterday in practice as it was today, and you realize it too late. And so one thing I always do when I try to fish tournaments is, if I'm not catching them the way I was in my practice day, which I rarely ever do, because, well, one, I never fish in practice. I'll talk about that here in a bit. But one of the things I always do is if I'm not getting bit the same way I was in my practice period, I'll sit down and look at all the factors that are on the table. What's the wind doing? What direction is the wind? What water temperature? What's the water clarity in the area? Has it changed? Is the current flowing differently? What are all the factors that have changed? And if you think about what has changed, then you can start trying to analyze what I'm doing wrong. And usually what I find is that, like, for example, when it's windier and there's more current, you can catch them better on reaction baits. When there's less current and less wind, you need to go to slower moving baits, dragging a worm or a jig. And it's just basic fishing 101 that everyone knows. But when you're in a tournament and you're under pressure, sometimes you're just so focused on trying to run all your spots in an order based on what you found in practice that you don't fish the moment. You don't think about, oh, the wind is not hitting this bank like it was yesterday. I probably either should slow down with a shaky head and drag a bait here slow, or maybe I should go run other wind-blown banks where I didn't catch fish, but maybe where the wind was not blowing yesterday and it is today. And just literally just thinking about the conditions for like half a second every hour or so can make a huge difference in your tournament fishing. And it's probably something that's second nature to you, Randy, but I think for a lot of guys that's not maybe something they think about.
Yeah, there's the key to it from what I found is you have to develop a balance between your intellect and your intuition. And if one of those gets a little bit, lopsided on one side, it can really affect you. But when you balance intellect and intuition, that's when you are at the very top of your game. And one of the things that a piece of advice I'll give everybody is we've all done this before. How many times have you've been fishing down a stretch of bank and you're not catching much and you just feel that you're just casting. You're not expecting to strike every single cast. If you ever feel like that, you need to put your rod down and either make a lure adjustment or crank up and leave and go somewhere else. Particularly if you're practicing for a tournament, because you have to learn to trust your instincts and intuition as an angler. And I really believe that, and I've talked to Clint about this a ton, and I've seen it in my own fishing, is, don't underestimate your instincts and your intuition in your fishing, particularly when you're looking and hunting for fish. Once you do find an area that you're getting a few bites, that's when you can start using the intellectual side as far as like what you're talking about, the wind direction, speed, lure retrieves, color, that type of stuff, because it's just another variable that goes with it. And there are so many variables in bass fishing as far as uncontrolled variables and controlled variables that's what makes it one of the most difficult sports that there is, for sure.
I definitely agree. And really quick, guys, I'm going to take a quick break. This discussion is really good, so I want to get back to it really fast. But I do want to let you guys know about a couple of things that Randy and I have going on that we're working pretty hard on. First are the Fish the Moment lake breakdowns. And you can actually go to fishthemoment.com and find map breakdowns that Randy makes, and we're putting out 5 a week on lakes all across the country, and we're doing summer breakdowns right now. And these breakdowns include 4 different areas on each lake with 15 spots in each area, and they're split up between offshore areas and shallow areas. So you get 60 spots spread out across the lake. We give you lure recommendations, descriptions of the area, and the best conditions to fish each area. And this week we added 5 new map breakdowns. We have Lake Norman in North Carolina, Greer's Ferry Lake in Arkansas, Lake Gunnersville, the lower end and the mid lake, as well as Lake Stockton in Missouri. And so these are some really good lakes here, and we're going to be putting out more this next week, and those should be going up here in the next couple days. And so a lot of great information here if you're trying to figure out where to start looking for fish. And this is really great, especially if you're a tournament fisherman, to pick up one of these maps and look at the areas that Randy suggests based on his tournament experience on these fisheries. And it will really help narrow down where you might want to start looking and really give you that little bit of a jump start. They may not give you the winning area, but a lot of times these areas will be close to what you should be looking for, and at least it'll get you looking at the right types of areas, and usually that's going to really accelerate your learning curve on the lake and really improve your fishing. And so these map breakdowns are awesome. I'm learning a ton just watching or just reading through them when Randy makes them, and awesome work here, Randy. Anything to add on this?
Yeah, it's really good really good tool as far as whether if you're a recreational fisherman or practicing for tournament, because most of these lakes, I'm going to say 95% of them, I've fished for the last 35 years. So not only I know the lakes fairly well, but I know the history of the lakes as far as like where other anglers did well at certain times of the year, where I've done well myself. And we go through and we give some of these areas to give you a really good starting point. And you can, once you see how these areas break down and lay out, you can go duplicate them in other areas of the lake. So what it does, it really cuts your time down a lot as far as finding those fish. I mean, because we're telling you exactly where these fish live at certain times of the year, and it just makes your time on the water a lot more efficient.
Awesome. That's great. Well, that's the Fishman Lake breakdowns. And then Randy and I are also going to be putting out a lot of YouTube content. I'm actually going to be looking to get an editor so that I don't have to try to edit all these videos, film, do all the website updates, all that stuff. And so hopefully that will mean a lot more Fishman content coming for you guys soon. We're going to try to bump up the number of videos per week by quite a bit. So excited about that. But now let's get back over to the discussion, Randy. And I want to lay out for you my approach for practice fishing that I've used over the years that probably is different from what you do, and I want to get your opinion on it. We've talked about it a little bit before in the past stream, and I also want to get your, let's say, practice strategy. Let's say you're going out to practice for a Bassmaster Open, and you have 2-3 days of practice. What would you be doing day 1, 2, 3? How do you split up your 3 days of practice? All that stuff. But let me explain my way of practicing, because I think it's going to be very different from what a lot of people do, and it's probably not the best for everyone, but I'll explain it and then we'll get to it. This might take a couple minutes, guys. I'm just going to switch over to a Navionics screen here and show you what I'm looking at though. So let's say, for example, I was going on Grand Lake, and Grand Lake is a lake that Randy's very familiar with, and I'm trying to figure out where I should be starting to fish. And for me, I'm really big on using my electronics, and I'm big at trying to figure out where the fish are in the lake just by using my electronics and using visual clues. And so whenever I go practice for a tournament, especially if I only have 1 day of practice, but even if I have 2 or 3 days, I spend 95% of my practice day, if not 100% of my day, just driving my boat around, just looking. What that means is I am not sometimes even bringing fishing poles with me. And when I fish 1 day tournaments, or when I'm practicing for 1 day, I don't bring fishing poles with me. And then when I'm practicing for 2 or 3 days, I might bring a few poles with me. But the reason I'm doing this is because I want to run into these different creeks. I want to gauge water temperature, water clarity. I want to see the available bait fish. I want to see how much fishing pressure each of the areas of the lakes is getting from local anglers and tournament anglers. And really what I'm trying to do is just find an area of the lake that I feel comfortable in, that I like the look of and the feel of. And for me, this is really helpful because I have a lot of experience on a lot of different fisheries and adapting on the fly. And so I have a lot of confidence in my ability to, let's say, go around Grand Lake, identify that the mouth of Horse Creek is where I want to fish, and then I'll identify some areas in my practice by graphing, whether it's some road beds or ledges or rock piles or whatever, and I'll figure out what the fish are doing on tournament day. I won't even catch fish, and I won't know what I'm going to do during the tournament to catch them. I'll have 15 rods on deck of the boat, and I'll just run around the lake and just, kind of fish the moment, fish the conditions. And it always worked out really well for me in my tournaments because I fished with a very open mind, and I scouted the lake beforehand. I knew the types of areas I wanted to check out. I also had experience knowing what types of areas are productive based on seasonal patterns, and I can also see that there's fish there with my electronics. So this is a great approach for me. But if you don't have confidence going into a tournament without having any fish in the boat, and you don't have, or catching any fish, and you don't have a strong grasp of a lot of different techniques from offshore fishing, shallow fishing, and throwing all these different baits, it's probably not the best approach to go after. It's probably more of an advanced approach. But that's what I've always done, and it's worked great for me. What are your thoughts on that approach, Randy? Does that sound crazy to you? Does that seem very different from what you hear other pros do? What are your thoughts there?
I think that that's the wave of the future. The way that you're talking about fishing there, that takes a lot of confidence in yourself to do that, because most people just have to get a few bites to get confident in at least having a starting point somewhere. And I've heard of some people doing that. Like I said, we've heard of Brian Thrift doing, fishing like that before. And it's really what works for you. I mean, that's the whole thing about it. Everybody's got their own style as far as how they like to approach the lake. And obviously it's been very effective for you because, I mean, it's just, from what I've just seen as your understanding of the bass and how you can get on the fish and figure the fish out so quick. I mean, that approach works for you, really well. For me, like I said, I may have to try that at some point. That's really sort of fascinating, how you do that. But the way that I fish for, my practice now is not anything like that. My particular approach in there is I'm always thinking in terms of areas. I'm not thinking in terms of patterns, because I look back at the tournaments that I've won, the tournaments that I've finished high in. I look at the tournaments that a lot of other anglers have won. Most of the time, it's in an area or a spot the tournaments are won on. And a lot of times they're won on one spot, like, where you're just within a cast of your boat. And a lot of times they're won in an area that you can just see around, like within a couple mile area. But most of the time, the winning fish come in groups, and those winning fish come in areas. So I'm always looking for areas that have the potential for that it has potential for the numbers and quality of fish that can hold over for a 4-day tournament. And that has to have the right amount of cover. It has to be positioned on the lake in an area that is not attracting a lot of attention, because it's very difficult to win a tournament out of a community hole. I mean, it's very rare to do that. So I'm sort of looking for these blind spots a little bit, some areas that maybe other anglers have bypassed, but areas that sort of have the potential for me to hold up for 4 days. But like I said, there's never one right approach. I mean, I'm hearing more and more and more, and you're one of the anglers that do it, that spend a lot of time idling, a lot of time graphing, a lot of time looking at your side imaging and down imaging, not just offshore deep, but even shallow. Figuring out how to pick those fish up in that 6 to 10 foot zone. So and I think that to me that is like that's the way that you're going to have to fish moving forward in this particular sport, because the competition is getting so stiff. But the problem, not really a problem, but the challenge with that is the way that you fish, Johnny, the way that Jacob Wheeler, you're sort of in that same vibe as Jacob Wheeler. I mean, you've got that same energy as far as what you look for and your understanding of the fish movements. If you fish like that, that takes a commitment. That takes a commitment to say that this is how I'm going to develop my style as a tournament angler. Where somebody like, maybe myself or John Cox or Tommy Biffle, it's like, I'm going to make that commitment to figuring out these shallow fish. I'm going to turn the shallow fishing into a science, the same way that Johnny Schultz or Jacob Wheeler, turns the electronics into a science. And both techniques can be effective depending upon, time of year and certain conditions. So there's always more than one way to catch them.
So I'm really intrigued by this finding an area, because that's kind of what I do when I'm trying to graph and use my electronics. I'm trying to identify that like 2 mile area, and usually I do that by trying to see where do I see a good quantity of bait fish, where do I find a good number of types of structures. So do I find a lot of good rock piles or brush, or there are lots of potential feeding points for these bass, and then also, like you said, finding areas that maybe don't look as obvious on the map. But I know how to do that with my electronics. I've talked about that in my videos before, in a lot of my videos. But if you're just going down the bank or fishing shallow water, flipping, maybe throwing a crankbait, chatterbait, stuff like that, what are your rules of thumb to determine if an area has enough fish to hold up for 3 days or 4 days? Like, is it the number of bites you get in the area? Is it the amount of time it takes you to get that many bites? Is it just the look of the water? Do you maybe not even need to get any bites in that area? What are your criteria to determine if that area is good?
Well, the thing, you're talking about shallow water fishing,
or just in general how you practice. So how you would go about finding them.
I look back at here again. I'm reflecting back on the tournaments that I've won in the past, and the thing that I'm looking for is, I do fish offshore. During the pre-spawn and during the post-spawn, I get off the bank like everybody else does. So it's not like I'm stuck on the bank like some people that just fish it all the time, because I was catching them deep crank in Grand Lake before there were GPS. So I know how to fish like that, and I like to fish like that. But the way that I prefer to fish is I want to find an area that I can catch them shallow, that has enough cover that will allow me to go in there and slow down like a snail and pick that cover apart with a fine-tooth comb. And for example, the first BASS tournament I ever won was at Bugs Island. I've seen on the comments here, there's several people from Bugs Island here. The area that I won that the Bassmaster Top 100 at Bugs Island was, I found a cove. This cove, you could basically cast across it. It was about as big as I'm going to guess it was about a little bit bigger than the infield of a baseball diamond, but it was completely lined with really thick willow trees. And I went through there with the trolling motor on low, making 20 or 30 casts to each willow tree, working like a snail, and I just went round and around this thing for 4 days and won the tournament off it, because it had enough cover to support, a good group of shallow water fish. So the biggest thing that you want to look for, if you're fishing, unless you're fishing for like suspended fish or you're fishing hard structure or something like that, you've got to have an area that you've got enough cover to support enough a big enough population of fish to actually place higher and win that tournament. And most of the time that comes in forms of docks, shallow water laydowns, standing cypress trees. I've been really good around cypress trees like that. Willow trees, something that you have a lot of complex cover. Some of the best tournaments I've ever had at Potomac River were on stretches of bank that had like laydowns, where you're like going to each laydown and making 30 or 40 casts to one laydown, and you're moving another 10 feet to another laydown. The area that you're fishing may not be that big, but it's got the right type of cover to hold a big population of fish.
So when you're trying to find these areas that are kind of off the beaten path, especially when you're trying to fish, I guess, shallower cover, like offshore structure stuff, what I do is I just look for spots on the map that don't look good, basically. And people see when they look at the map where the creek channels are, the humps, the points, stuff like that. I look for an area that like just doesn't have any of that stuff that's like easy to spot. That's what I do to find them. I just made a video about that this last week. If you guys haven't seen that one, I put it out on Friday. But with trying to find an area, and it can be for offshore or up shallow, how do you go, like, you're fishing on the Bassmaster Opens, FLW Tour, Top 150s, Elite Series, stuff like that. How do you find areas that are not being fished by a lot of those type of anglers? So I feel like everyone has that same mindset. I need to find areas to myself, and if everyone's doing that, then aren't all the unobvious stuff also being fished? Do you have to find like the ugliest of the ugly spots, or like what's the whole thought process there?
Well, the golden rule that you always have to remember is that you can't take yourself away from the fish to get away from the fisherman, because I was guilty of that worse than anybody. And I still am to some extent. I used to, like, if I saw anybody, I would leave. I wanted to have the lake to myself. I wanted to be as far away from anyone as I could get. And a lot of times, you have to fish around people. That's part of it. But there's two pieces of advice I would give anglers as far as when they're practicing to stay away from. Number one, I try to stay away from the back of the coves, and I try to stay away from points, because points and the back end of coves get the most pressure from tournament anglers by far. I don't care almost any time of year that you're fishing a tournament. The first thing you'll see these guys they run right to the back of every cove on the lake, and they start fishing whatever visible available cover is in the back of the coves. They get pounded like that. And yeah, you may roll in there the first day of practice and you catch a good bag of fish, but by the time the tournament started or the tournament's going on, that those areas are over with. The same with points. I mean, points are great places to catch fish. They're consistent, but they attract a lot of attention. So the thing that I'm looking for, just like what you're talking about with your offshore electronics, you're looking for those subtle areas that maybe get overlooked by your GPS mapping systems. Places that are real obvious on the mapping systems. I'm looking for those areas in shallow water that get overlooked as well. And a lot of those particular areas come from isolated cover areas that maybe when somebody's running down a lake, if you've ever noticed, here's a good little tip that I learned from Rick Clunn years ago. When you're running down a lake, a lot of people tend to run the lake the same way. They'll sort of cut corners, if the lake's winding a little bit. And every time you cut a corner or you're sort of like running down a lake, there's always a portion of the lake that gets overlooked, that's away from that path running down the lake. So, and those are the areas, that I try to focus in on I try to look where, other people wouldn't think is quite so obvious. And also on top of that is it can be something as simple as your boat positioning and your casting angle, because when you're working down a bank, I don't care what it is, if it's boat docks, if it's trees, if it's laydowns or whatever. I'm always thinking about, okay, what cast can I make? How can I position my boat? How can I cast at this angle that people don't want to mess with it? It's like it's too awkward. It's too hard to cast underneath there. You've got to turn your boat at a cockeyed angle to get to it. That's what I'm looking for. And for example, I fished Lake of the Ozarks, Grand Lake. I grew up on those, tons of boat docks. To me, it's like I don't even fish in between the boat docks. It's like the areas between docks that most people that are open that you can get in and cast. In my opinion, you're wasting your time. If you catch them, they're going to be small fish. I'm always looking to get in there and fight those cables, get underneath the cables, underneath the walkways. Trying to get that angle that a lot of people miss over there. So so basically back to the original question is, once you do locate this area that may be a little bit off the beaten path or a little bit inobvious, you have to maximize that area through boat positioning and angles, which is a totally another topic.
For sure, and that's something that we could definitely get into. That's probably what I'm going to be doing a lot when we're doing these shallow versus offshore challenges. I have a feeling that there's going to be some points in the year where those fish just aren't very plentiful way offshore, like let's say 10 foot or deeper of water. And so I think a lot of times I'm going to be having to fish like isolated stumps on flats or lay downs on flats. I love fishing like that. That's one of my favorite ways of fishing Lake Dardanelle and like all the shallow, dirty water lakes. When everyone else is running shallow water willow, getting in the backwaters, I'm fishing like sandbar flats with like one lay down, or one sneaky thing on these sandbar flats guys do is they'll plant pallets, like shipping pallets, and they'll put rocks in them because the pallets are only 6 inches tall, and they'll put them up on top of these sand flats so they're 2-3 feet deep, and you can run the pallets that people put out there, and I know where some of them are just from my buddies. You can crank those pallets in like August and catch like 18 pounds of fish. and no one will ever find them because you won't see them. But you can actually side image the sandbars and see the pallets down there, and you're like, what is this like thing? Is this square thing with holes in it? And that's the kind of stuff that I love trying to find. It's kind of cool. But one thing that I did want to really dig into a little bit here is how much time do you spend in practice trying to identify the secret bait? One thing that I've heard about on, I don't know if it was a podcast or some sort of YouTube video, is a story about Edwin Evers. And they were fishing on like Sam Rayburn Lake, I think, in like January. And as you know, Sam Rayburn Lake, January, you're going to be fishing a lipless crankbait through grass. And he was fishing through these areas, these ditches and, flats with the grass. And when the guy pulled up to him, I forget who the angler was, but he pulled up the next day when Evers, he looked in the bottom of his boat and he saw 20 or 30 different lipless crankbaits in the bottom of the boat of different colors and different brands. And he's like, did you spill your tackle box? Like, is there an issue? Or like, what happened there? And when he's like, oh, no, I'm just trying to figure out the right vibration and color that these fish want. And apparently that was what he was doing, is all day switching these lipless crankbaits up with different vibrations, different sounds, because a lot of people throw a red-eye shad. A lot of people throw you a rattle trap or maybe an Excalibur lipless crankbait. So maybe going to a unique brand might be good. Maybe throwing a weird color is good. How much time do you spend trying to dial in all that stuff, or is that stuff you kind of do during the tournament?
I think bait and color is so important. It's so critical for so many different reasons. First of all, your confidence. I mean, there's nothing that builds confidence more in an angler than knowing that you're throwing something a little bit different, whether it be color or bait or profile or whatever. Because to me, as a tournament angler, the worst thing that I can have is if I feel like I'm throwing just another bait that everybody else is in the tournament. I mean, that to me is like my confidence is really affected by that. Unless I have an area that's just on fire, I'm wanting to find a bait that's just a little bit different. So that's why to me I really put a big emphasis on depending on the technique you're using, but on color, on your weight size, on the profile, the bait that you're using, whether it be soft plastics or hard baits or whatever like that. And I agree, just like what you said with Edwin. I mean, he may have taken it to the extreme, but I'm always tweaking and practicing and trying different stuff to see what the fish want the best. And the thing that you have to do in order to make this efficient is you have to get into an area that where there's a few fish at. Say, for example, if we're jerkbait fishing. I mean, if you start getting on a little area that you're getting a few bites on the jerkbait, that's when you can really maximize that particular that technique and any other technique, because you can go through your colors and your profiles of the bait, knowing that there's fish in the area that are actually seeing that particular bait. And once you dial in on that right color, the right action, the right cadence, the right retrieve, everything that goes with it, that's when it's the best as far as practicing for a tournament is getting that bait that you got a lot of confidence in, that somebody may not be using that much. Big deal. I really believe it.
Another question I guess I had is, I want to stick with the baits, but before I forget this question, one thing that I've always struggled with that I've never been able to figure out is how do you figure out if the fish want your bait to be fished slower when you're trying to practice and find fish in cover water? I'm always been of the approach of I'm just going to cover as much water as possible, find those active fish, and like they on Table Rock, like I was pulling up, making 6 casts on the spot and leaving. I'd see them on my graph. If they didn't bite in 5-6 casts, I'm gone. And, that produced a lot of fish for me today. A little teaser. And by the way, there will be footage from that Table Rock trip, both from me and Randy. We had cameras in both our boats. But it works for me, and it works 95% of the time for me. There's a couple situations where I do need to slow down, but usually I figure that out more on accident than on purpose. How do you go about that approach of maybe an area is good, you just really need to slow down and throw a weightless Cinco and just fish it super, super slow. And, if you do that, you catch 15 pounds versus if you went through there with a spinnerbait, you don't get any bites and you think the area is terrible.
Yeah. And that's a great question. And like I said, that's something you have to determine every tournament. But I don't really think in terms of fishing like fast or slow. To me, it's about finding the right pace, and that pace may be fishing faster. Just a nice medium speed, or the pace may be slow for the day. A lot of it depends on how efficient that you can fish the cover that you're fishing at that pace, because you want to make sure that you never want to slop through an area, because a lot of times, and when you're doing it, when people start fishing a little bit too fast, you can feel yourself fishing too fast. So
Mm.
if you're fishing areas that have a lot of complex cover in them, where you have to come at it at different angles, yeah, that's sometimes you need to slow down. If you're going down the bank burning a spinner bait, or burning a rattle trap or something like that, where you're just making long casts and chunking and winding, you can turn up the troll motor a little bit and cover more water and do that. So a lot of it depends on what type of cover is in the area. Um, Grass is a prime example for I've never seen anyone in a grass lake that fishes fast that does great. I mean, most of the time, if you're fishing grass, you're fishing some type of a slow technique, or you're milking an area out really good, simply because there's so many ambush points. So that's think in terms of that. Think in terms of developing the right pace and analyzing how many ambush points that a fish has. The more ambush points they have, the slower you got to fish.
Now, another question I have is kind of more in line with like the tournament fishing approach. Have you found that when you get like into tournament mode, especially like on like a Saturday or a Sunday, whether it's fishing a BFL on a Saturday or you make it to like day 3 or day 4 of a tournament, do you see that you have to start adjusting your tactics in terms of maybe putting the crankbaits away and going to more of like a drop shot shaky head? Or have you found that maybe instead of trying to adjust your tactics to get those fish in the same area to eat, you will change up and go to a new section or a new area if those fish aren't cooperating? You get what I'm going for there?
Yeah, if you make it throughout the course of the tournament, sometimes it's sooner than later. Sometimes it's the first day of the tournament. Some days it's the last day. But very seldom do you not have to make some type of an adjustment, whether it be bait size, bait type, color, that type of stuff. It's particularly if you're fishing an area where you're making multiple passes down an area. If you're going back and forth over the same water, you better have several different profiles, several different colors of the same bait that you're throwing to really maximize that water, because those fish will definitely get conditioned to something like that. If you're fishing a pattern, maybe not so much, but uh, I'm going to say that, God, probably 90% of the tournaments that I've done good in, like top 10 finishes, um, you're starting with maybe a bigger, more aggressive power bait, and as the tournament wears on, you're downsizing a little bit. That another Bassmaster tournament I won, the top 150 at Mobile Delta. The first 3 days of the tournament, I was catching them on a big jig, fishing laydowns with it. Big, full-sized half-ounce jig with a big salty chunk trailer on it, big profile jig. And the last day of the tournament, they just wouldn't bite it very good, and I wound up catching them on a little 4-inch ringworm. Just threw it, just put it on because they quit biting the jig and started catching fish just as good on that little ringworm over the same water. So, and that's happened time and time again, not just in that tournament, but I've seen it happen over and over.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's something I've found that happens a lot. I haven't really fished as many of those. Like, I've never fished a 4-day tournament. No, I take that back. I fished a 5-day. I fished several 5-day tournaments actually for the high school fishing world finals. But that was kind of a weird format because they would zero the weights halfway through like multiple times. It's kind of a weird. I don't know why I did it that way, but I've only ever fished like 3-day tournaments where it's cumulative weight, and so practicing for those type of tournaments is very interesting, because what I always found is that I could never find enough fish in practice to carry me through for a 3-day event. It never happened. But what I found is that I always would take time during my actual tournament, once I caught fish, to kind of experiment. And that's one thing I think a lot of guys don't do, even like in a 1-day derby, is they'll get this like basically this very set pattern that I'm going to fish at this spot from 8 to 9, and then the next spot from 9 to 10, and the next spot from 10 to 10:30, and like this systematic approach. And a lot of times when I'm fishing a tournament, especially even if I have spots found, I'll just randomly roll up on a bank if I see a blue heron over there, or I'll pull up on the stretch and I'm like, ooh, that looks kind of good, and I'll fish it for 10 minutes. And I'm not even gonna, bother fish if I fish it in practice or if it even is fitting my pattern. Sometimes I just get this instinct and go for it. And a lot of times that helped me find new patterns that carried me through those events to the final day and to get really good finishes. But is that something you do a lot where you will just hit new water, or is it to a point where when you're fishing these Elite Series events or the FLW Tour or whatever, that all the areas are already getting picked off, so really you kind of have to stake your claim and fish that area?
Well, a big tournament is so much different. A lot of it depends on the size of the tournament you're fishing. But to me, fishing pressure to me has the biggest impact of anything that there is in a tournament. I hear guys talk all the time. Say for example, the weather's been sort of nasty and it's supposed to get stable weather coming up in the tournament, and they're going to say, "Oh yeah, by the last day of the tournament, they're really going to turn on." That never happens hardly, because the fishing pressure neutralizes that. So, the thing that I'm always looking for in that is you have to watch your competitors, where they're rolling into, as far as areas that are getting a little bit more traffic or areas that are getting less traffic, because you cannot underestimate, and this is probably one of the biggest tips I can give weekend fishermen, tournament fishermen, whatever. You cannot underestimate the impact that fishing pressure and boats have in an area. Trolling motors, electronics, just rolling through the area, people coming through an area and jacking fish in practice. I mean, you can't underestimate what a negative effect that has on fishing. So when you're hunting for those areas, you got to keep that in mind as much as you do for actually looking for fish, because you can have a really good area in practice that you're getting a lot of bites in, but if you see people coming in and out of that area, it's neutralizing that area. And you may have an area that you found that you're not getting as many bites, but you've got it to yourself, and that can sometimes turn out to be the better area.
Yeah, and that's what happened like this last Toyota series that Jacob Wheeler won. We were kind of talking about that today when we were at the boat ramp, that he caught the majority of his fish off of small little 3 to 7 fish schools out in Pickwick, and like these little random areas. And I talked about that in a recent video, actually, exactly kind of what Jacob ended up doing that same weekend, which is kind of weird timing. But he did catch some fish off the community holes as well. And so what he would do is whenever one of the community holes would open up, he would roll in there, fish them real quick, maybe pick up a fish or two, and then leave. And then he'd go back to his like kind of sneaky areas. And I've done that for years. That's something I kind of started doing on Lake Dardanelle back in 2013, 2012, where I would have all the community holes where everyone knew where the fish were. And especially when you're fishing in the local derbies on lakes where there's not that much like offshore structure on a lake, all the good offshore structure holes are covered up. And so what I always had to do was find the very sneaky out of the way areas that had like nothing on them, and I could catch 2 to 3 fish off of those, and then I would catch 2 or 3 fish off the community holes. And I've talked about that like countless times on this channel. I give that advice. Try to catch fish both off community holes and off of these secret stretches. Is that something that you do as well, Randy, where it's like maybe you run down the bank, you're like, hey, there's been 12 guys who fished down that bank, but no one's been there for 45 minutes. I'm going to roll over there and fish a unique random bait and try to pick off a fish? Or do you kind of just assume those fish are just too beat up to even try fishing?
No, I cannot stand fishing offshore community holes, because to me it's like it's stressful. You're always dealing with some type of like potentially explosive situation. If you get say you're practicing on a community hole in practice and you get some good bites, you may wind up boat 150 in the tournament, and you get there and there's 10 boats there, and you're done. Prime example at Toho, that a couple of years ago that we were fishing down there, I found this one area that was loaded with big ones down there, and there was a couple other boats on that particular spot too, fishing around, and I knew they were catching them. I mean, I didn't see them catch them, but it was just too easy. And sure enough, I was boat like 165. I got drawn out in the tournament, and when I got there, I couldn't even fish it. It's like my best area. I never even got a fish. So
Wow.
yeah, that's so from that standpoint is I don't really like fishing community holes, but if you do have a bait, I mean, that's like some off the wall deal that nobody else is fishing, by all means do it, because I mean they're community holes for a reason. They hold fish all the time. They attract schools of fish, but those areas like that, the community holes are going to become less and less effective as time goes on with this electronic technology. Excuse me. And the way that like you and Jacob Wheeler fish, I mean that is cutting edge fishing. When you're going out and you're looking for little 2 and 3 fish, 4 fish schools on these inobvious type areas, there's not many people that fish like that. But that is really the future of fishing on a lot of these lakes that have a lot of offshore structure.
Yeah, and that's for me really one of the biggest keys to my success when I was hermit fishing is trying to. It was always getting way away from people, away from the other competitors, whether it's running way up a river or something else, or finding that inobvious kind of random stuff. And like one example I can give you from Lake Dardanelle, I'm going to share a screen here. And I'm just going to give one creek away. Hopefully, I don't get too much crap for this from my buddies. But it was a creek where you were running from down here by the boat ramp, and the only way you could basically get away from fishing pressure, because it was actually during this high school fishing world finals, and there was like, oh my gosh, I don't even know, there were so many people fishing in this event. I think it was 300 boats or something crazy, and I was running way up this river, so you got all the way up basically to as far as you could go up the lake, like way up here. And one of the creeks we ended up catching them in is one of these little tiny creeks that was like right in through here. And there was some fish stacked up in this creek, and it was like a 45-minute run. No one was up here, and there weren't that many fish in it, but there was enough, and there were some decent quality fish that you could pull in there, catch a limit for 15 to 17 pounds, and then leave. And we only fished it 2 days of the tournament because there wasn't that many fish in there, and we basically just kind of fished a bunch of random stuff to kind of get our few fish in the boat. But then on the final 2 days we pulled in here, the first day we pulled in here, I think we had 16 pounds in 8 minutes. The second day we pulled in here, which is the final day of the tournament, within 7 casts we had 16 pounds. We doubled up on frogs, 2 casts in a row. It was just boom boom, they were just loaded in here. But to get there, you had to run all the way up the lake away from here, and between here and here, there's a lot of water, and a lot of people don't run this far up the river just because there's so much good-looking stuff in between. But that's the reason we were up here. We literally launched up here on purpose, looking for stuff in these backwaters that none of the other 300 boats would be fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And one other thing, too, that was kind of interesting is there is a little community hole stretch that was right here that is like the biggest community hole of lily pads. It's Goose Island, and there used to be a lot of pads here. There's not as much anymore. And one thing that we did that was interesting is everyone rolled through here with a frog. And they threw a frog down these pads all day long. And on the last day of the tournament, we rolled up here. We figured this out in practice, just trying random stuff. My partner realized he could catch him flipping a 1-ounce jig in the edge of the lily pads in 4 foot of water. And it was a 1-ounce black and blue jig. It was July, middle of summer. We were flipping a jig into the edge of the lily pads. And on the final day of that tournament, he caught a 6.5 and like a 4-pounder. Boom, boom. Flipping this stretch right here. And everyone was throwing a frog, and we were flipping 1-ounce jigs where he was. I couldn't figure that out. I was not a big fan of that whole technique, but he was great at it. And it was just kind of crazy that's what we caught him on. And then another spot that we caught him on during the tournament was like over here, and it was just a random little ledge spot that was like right up on top of here is a little shell bed. And one of the days of the tournament, we pulled up here and caught like, I think I caught a 4.5 and a 3-pounder back-to-back casts right here. And so just like little stuff that like are kind of sneaky but kind of community holes. That's just what I always am looking for, or either sneaky areas like that sneaky little ledge area that no one really fished, or a sneaky creek up here, or then going in those community holes and flipping a bait or fishing a bait that no one's throwing. Just going right behind people but fishing a unique bait. those are that's always the way I've gone about it, and it's always been pretty effective for me in tournaments. Does that kind of ring true with what you're doing as well, Randy, or at least something you've done before?
Yeah, a lot of the places that you're talking about like that, I mean, those are places maybe that I'll pull in, just to try to pick up a fish or two. But they're not any places I've tried to develop a game plan around as far as my practice goes. Those oddball community holes, stuff like that. I mean, like I said, for me, basically, like I said, I'm looking for an area that I can get away from some people. That I can put that trolling motor down, make multiple passes over the same water. But like I said, you can't in tournament fishing or fishing in general. You can't like overthink it into the point that you take yourself away from areas that the fish live in, just to simply to try to get away from the fishing pressure, or where you think there's going to be too many people at. And that's when, like you said, coming there with a different technique is key on that. So it's tournament fishing and fishing in general is not the same as it was 30 years ago. I mean, the skill level of everybody is taken such a quantum leap over the past 5 or 6 years that it's really it's a thinking sport. I mean, it's you really have to use your every aspect. You got to use your intuition, your creativity, your ingenuity, your imagination. All that stuff comes into play.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like even today, we were on Table Rock, and I'll tease a little bit. I've shown it on Instagram, but I caught some fish fishing a spy bait over like 25 foot of water, and like that's something that a lot of guys will fish these same areas with a swim bait or with a football jig, stuff like that. And I was throwing that spy bait. It's just a bait that no one's really throwing. And if you looked at the baits that I normally throw on Table Rock this time of year, I fish a hair jig, a spy bait, and it's called a surge shad, but it's basically one of the old red fins, a cotton cordell red fin. And between a spy bait, a hair jig, and a red fin, that's 3 baits that very few people are going to be throwing regardless. And I'm fishing them in very obvious community holes, but because I'm throwing that unique bait, it works so well. On Table Rock, there's so many fish anyways that it just is good. But that's something that I really focus on when I'm trying to, especially just fish for my videos and stuff, is what random techniques that I've seen on Bassmasters or read on magazines can I adapt to my fishery. And like even on Lake Dardanelle, I remember one tournament that I was fishing. It was actually a college regional championship I won. I caught most of my fish off this isolated random shell bed I actually talked about in my last video. It was like up on this flat, caught like 16, 17 pounds of fish off of it. And couldn't get any more bites there. So I went to the most obvious community hole area on the whole lake, which was a road bed that ran out into the middle of the lake, dropped off in the channel. Everyone was fishing it. I saw 12 people fish it that day already. And I pulled right in after someone left, and everyone was throwing deep diving crankbaits, football jigs, 10-inch worms, Carolina rigs on it. And I came in behind him with a hair jig on Lake Dardanelle, which I guarantee you it was probably one of the 5 bass ever caught on a hair jig on Lake Dardanelle to that point ever. Maybe the other 4 were fish I've caught before because no one was throwing it. I know all the locals, I know all the dudes. No one was throwing a hair jig. This was back like when Jacob Wheeler first let the hair jig out of the bag on Lake Chickamauga in 2011. And so like I threw that hair jig down there, let it fall down, reeled it up, boom, 4.5 pounder, caught it there right as someone was leaving. And the guys that were like around, they're like, we haven't seen anyone catch a fish there all day. Everyone's fished it. You're the only one who's caught a fish there. And it's just because I had that unique bait. And so that is really a big key. If you're going to fish community holes, unless you're fishing on a weekday and there's no fishing pressure there, you need to throw something somewhat different or unique, unless it's like perfect conditions where it's like wind blown, cloudy wind, which that really never happens.
Yeah.
So, well, that's, I think that's a really good kind of way to end that was getting further away from practice and more just into tournament fishing, but I think that we covered practice fishing pretty well at the beginning here. There's so much more to get into, though, and one thing that Randy and I are planning on doing as well is trying to get in some local team tournaments and doing some practice videos to show you how we would practice, and maybe have Randy go out in his boat, I go out in my boat, compare how we practice, and then try to like meld the two together, because I feel like there's ways that I can improve my practice technique, and I feel like there might be some ways that Randy can take some of the stuff I do to improve his practicing technique. We might be able to combine like the graphing like extreme offshore electronic stuff with the experience, the knowledge, and kind of the philosophy that Randy has, and I think that we could get some really good results with that. So I'm excited about that as well. But yeah, so next thing I want to do here is try to take a few questions from you guys. We're just going to spend about 15 minutes, I think, doing some Q&A. But if you guys have any questions, just leave a comment in the live stream here, and we will get to them. So I'm just going to go through some of the comments here, but definitely leave a question. Just type @fish of the moment and type that in there, and we will answer as many questions as we can get to. There's none in there so far, so the first person to type their question in there will get it answered for sure. So one question that we did get from Ernest is, do you ever fish around like released areas? Actually, it was for us. It was for someone else. I remember seeing that earlier. Do you ever focus on fishing released fish areas? Like, let's say you know that there's big tournaments coming out of a certain boat ramp. Do you go fish around that boat ramp knowing that there's going to be a lot of released fish there? Or is that something that, like, all the tournament guys do, and so you don't really bother trying that?
For me, that's just opportunistic because a lot of the release area fish, let's say, for example, where our tournaments are going out of, it totally depends on the boat draw that you have. I remember one term we had a tournament on Lake Murray, South Carolina, and it was a early March tournament. And the first day of the tournament, I caught a few, and I was like towards the last boat out in the tournament. And the second day of the tournament, I was boat number 1. So I just said, man, I know there's a bunch of fish released around here. So I said, I'm just going to start right here. So they called my name out, boat number 1, and I idled like 50 feet from the checkout boat right to where the off limits line started, and I started fishing and started throwing crankbait just right there, and they were calling like boat 8, boat 9, boat 10. By the time they got to boat 35, I had 2 5-pounders in the boat, and I wound up catching 24 pounds right there on a release area. So if I've got an early draw, sometimes I'll do it, or I'll hit it on the way in, but I don't ever make a game plan out of it, to fish it all day long.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's something I've never really done. Really in tournaments, I know some buddies who've done really well doing that, like on certain lakes where they'll go fish released areas. But for me, it's never been like a go-to strategy. I might try it, but like it's been helpful sometimes. But really, it's never been like you said, a core part of my strategy.
The release in tournament fishing, a lot of times the release areas, they're the areas that produce the last day of the tournament because the tournaments have been cut down to the top 10. There's been a lot of fish released. And there's been tournaments won, and a lot of guys do very well fishing release areas the final day of the tournament.
Gotcha. That's really good information. Here's a question here from Mike B. He asks, how do you know you're fishing the wrong spot versus using the wrong bait?
Yeah, that's a great question as far as, that goes back to, being at the right time at the right area. And for me, the good rule of thumb is say, for example, I'm going through an area and I'll use the example today, when Johnny and I went fishing today, without giving too much away, I was really confident in the pattern that I started fishing, and I committed to my pattern, and I thought it was a matter of just running enough of that type of water, and throughout the course of the day, I'll get bit. Now, sometimes you have to make that decision. Do you want to stay in the same water and adjust your technique, or do you want to change water and stay with the same technique? And that's something that it's sort of just a judgment call. If you're fishing a bait that you're getting a few good bites on, or you feel like that's going to produce better fish, a lot of times you want to stay with that bait and change your areas. But if you're fishing an area that you're just not getting many bites at all in, and you're not overly confident in the bait that you're throwing, that's a good time to change area. But that's a question. That's a really good question that the tournament fishermen have to deal with every time. And it's usually one of those two things. It's the area change or bait change.
Yeah, I always find that especially for me, if I see a lot of fish in my electronics and I feel like they're catchable based on my experience and just kind of what I know is going on, I'll go through a lot of different baits. I'll cycle through 7, 8, 9 baits sometimes if I really feel like an area is good, just like I did today on Table Rock to find that spy bait that was working. But a lot of times it's more along the lines of just getting into an area where those fish are active and feeding. And most of the time I feel like if I just put myself in the right area, I'm going to get bit, even if I'm not throwing the perfect bait. Now, there all have exceptions to that as well, kind of going off what Randy said, but just kind of some thoughts there. Another question here is from Alex. Alex asks, too often I find when I'm looking for the unique bait, I end up chasing my tail and have 100 baits on the floor of the deck. How do I keep from doing this? Any thoughts there, Randy?
Yeah, I'm sort of the same way in practice a lot of times, particularly with colors. You're just always trying to find something that's producing the most bites and the biggest bites. And, the thing about what you want to remember on a deal like that is if you're fishing a bait that looks good in the water and you're confident that it'll get bit and that all the information that you've assimilated, you feel that this is the right technique that you've been using, that's the time to really focus more on your area rather than the bait. Because if you find a really good area that's got the fish biting in it, they'll hit a lot of different baits. And you may not have to throw the number one or the best bait if you're in a good area. So a good area will outweigh the need to have the right bait. But a lot of times it's just a matter of experimentation until you find that balance.
Definitely agree with that, Randy. Question here from Ken. This is kind of just a very broad question, so we can kind of do a little quick sip in it, but we don't want to spend too much time on it. But he says, how do you approach a lake this time of year that's full of timber? And that can be very broad because, like, for example, Table Rock has a lot of timber. Lake Washita has a lot of timber. Those are both very deep, clear lakes. But then you have a lot of these Texas lakes, like a Ray Roberts Lake, which someone wants us to break down, which is also a lake that's full of timber, which is maybe dirtier and shallower. So do you have any general tips for fishing timber, Randy, that might be helpful for June to July, August?
Yeah, sure. There's two determining factors in that would be the water clarity and the water depth the timber is, and if the timber is submerged or if the timber is sticking out of the water. Which there's very few lakes in the country that the timber is sticking out of the water anymore. Most of it's busted off or at the shoreline level. But if you're fishing water visibility that is like greater than 4 or 5 feet and the water is deeper than like 15 or 20 feet, a lot of those fish are going to be suspended in that timber. Most of the time, they'll be suspended in it. And you want to use techniques, that'll catch those suspended fish. But if you're fishing areas that have timber in like less than, say, 10 foot of water, and you have water visibilities of like less than 3 feet, those fish are most likely going to be on the bottom in that timber, particularly if the water clarity goes down and if the water depth goes down. So the good rule of thumb, if the water visibility is over 4 feet, focus on suspended fish. If it's under 4 feet, fish the bottom.
Awesome. That's perfect. I completely agree. Question from Robert. Do you guys subscribe to the panic box theory during a tournament? So I'll kind of take this one first. I'm assuming what he means by panic box is like, if you're not catching any fish, do you have like a set of 4 or 5 baits, confidence baits that you'll always go to pick up? Like, hey, I'm going to throw my 1 or 2 confidence baits and try to catch them that way. I personally don't subscribe to that, and I've actually thought about this a lot because a lot of guys will say, this is my confidence bait. My confidence bait, if you have, I think they ask this question all the time on like Bass Talk Live podcasts, is like, what's your number one confidence bait if you just had to pick something up and throw it? I don't have one of those. I've racked my brain to figure out which one that is, and I've tried to become so versatile. It's to the point where I don't have ultimate confidence in any one bait. What I try to do is read the water and let the fish tell me what bait I need to throw. And that's why I carry like 15 rods on the deck of the boat, because I'm confident in throwing all the different baits. And so whichever bait matches the conditions, I'm going to throw it. And so it's not like if I'm struggling in a fishing day or a tournament, I'm just going to put all the rods away and pick up a shaky head, or put all the rods away, pick up a jig, something like that. Never have been big on that. I'll always just keep running with lots of different baits and trying stuff. And sooner or later, I usually get bit. But what about you, Randy?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there, Johnny, for sure. There probably, I mean, to answer that question, as far as the panic box, there's 2 baits that if I need a fish, say for example, I've got 4 fish and I'm running out of time. I got 30 minutes to fish or something like that, and I'm not. It's like it's more important for me to catch like a 2 pounder than it is a 5 pounder, and it's more realistic to catch a 2 pounder. I usually go to a small crankbait or shaky head. Shaky head if the water's a little bit cleaner, if the water's dirtier, like a real small crankbait. And normally, if there's any fish down there that'll bite, keeper sized fish, they're going to hit one of those too under more conditions than not.
Awesome, yeah. So this is from Flossie Mabe. He says, I fish for bass in South Carolina. I have the equipment and everything, but just can't find the fish. Seems like if I do, it's just a fluke. I have friends that just kill it. What is my deal? 2 ways I'll answer that. 1, fishing is hard. It is not easy. It takes lots of time on the water and experience to be able to find fish consistently. I did not find fish consistently for the first 10 years of my fishing experience. It's hard to just go out and catch fish like I do in videos or like Randy does. And we go out and catch fish too because we have lots of experience to work on, but we also are always showing when we're doing well. I don't always go out and catch fish. There's days where I just don't catch them. I usually catch fish, but again, I have a lot more experience probably than you've had on the lakes and things like that. And also, it comes with understanding what the best techniques are and what the best areas are in each season on your lake. So if you're fishing in the South Carolina lakes, you need to figure out which types of baits, which types of areas are most productive on your fishery. And one thing that's really helpful to do that is actually checking out some of our Fish the Moment lake breakdowns that we have on our website, fishthemoment.com. We have Lake Murray in South Carolina. We have a few other South Carolina lakes over here, and we also have some North Carolina lakes that are kind of fit that bill. And I would definitely recommend checking out some of these map breakdowns on the North Carolina and South Carolina lakes and looking at the areas that we're recommending. A lot of times it's more just trying to figure out what types of areas are the most productive in your area of the country, what types of points to look for, what water depths, what baits to throw. That's what these lake breakdowns are designed to do. And so even if it's not, these lake breakdowns aren't on the exact lake you're fishing, find a lake that's close, like a Lake Wiley in South Carolina, or maybe if it's a clear lake, a Lake Murray, something like that, and pick the season of these map breakdowns you want us to break down. And we'll be adding a ton to the website, 5 a week, so maybe just wait a couple weeks to pick one up. But this is the best way that I can recommend maybe jump starting your learning curve. Is that kind of what you would recommend as well, Randy, or do you have any other tips for him to just start catching fish in general?
Yeah, very well said. Totally agree on that. The one thing I'd add on that is probably the best thing you can do to just become a better fisherman quicker than anything else is practice your casting skills. I mean, if you're a good caster, if you can put a bait where you want it to be, pitching, flipping, casting, skipping, spinning rod, bait caster, flipping stick, it goes a long way into catching fish, just being a really good, accurate caster. You can't underestimate how important it is.
Awesome. Adam, I've seen this a couple questions several times is, are y'all going to do a lake breakdown of Ray Roberts? Yes, we will. That is the answer to that question. We will do that probably for all seasons. J. Crow, quick question here. How deep of water on Grand Lake is deep water fishing? 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50. What is deep water fishing on Grand Lake, in your opinion, Randy?
I think at Grand, if you're getting down in that 20-foot zone, that's considered deep water fishing. I mean, most of the bigger fish at Grand Lake, you're going to be catching them in that 10 to 15-foot zone most of the time. Although the cleaner the water is at Grand, the more those fish, some of them will suspend out over that deeper water, that 30 to 40 foot of water, but not as much as those fish using that 15 to 20. But yeah, I'd consider 20 foot fairly deep water at Grand.
Yeah, for Grand Lake, the deepest I've caught a bass on the bottom is 24 feet of water. And that was in the clear end of the lake when it was very, very clear down by the dam. I would say on Grand Lake, 25 feet and shallower is where you should be focusing. Don't fish deeper than 25 feet. If you could fish over 25, over like let's say 50 foot of water for bass that are in 25 feet, but that's not really that big of a pattern there anyways. Just focus on 25 feet and shallower on Grand, you're good to go. question from Anthony from Bass Camp. What's up, Anthony? What's the first place you look after the spawn for bass? Drop-offs, stumps, or the summer holes? So do you go, Randy, when you're looking for bass right after they spawn, straight offshore, or do you kind of look for the in-between zones? Where are you looking?
Well, a lot of it depends on the type of water that you're fishing. The one thing that I found out is when those bass, when they get into the post spawn, like when it's the hardcore post spawn, which is sort of like right now, there'll be a group of those fish that go deep immediately right after the spawn. There's a group that'll stay shallow, but there's a group that'll go deep. But the thermoclines haven't really started forming in June, so those fish, they can get down 30, 40 feet, even right after the spawn. Of course, they'll start moving a little bit shallower when that thermocline, starts forming in towards July and August. So, but yeah, you can go deep right off the bat. It's happening right now.
For sure, and that's one thing I think is a big misconception is that people think they need to fish like up towards the bank for a while after the bass spawn. I find right when those bass spawn, they will just jump straight deep. And a lot of times they'll go the deepest they'll be all year right after they spawn. Especially on a lot of lakes, they'll go, if the deepest they get is 30 feet of water, they'll go right there right after they spawn in May, first week of June, whatever it is. And then they'll actually get shallower as the summer progresses, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So that's pretty much all we have time for. I see a lot more questions, guys. Sorry we couldn't get to everything. I typed in the comments. No one was typing questions, and I was kind of egging them on over here. And then everyone apparently started to put questions. So appreciate all the comments. Sorry if we couldn't get to all of them, but glad that we could at least get to some of your questions. And hopefully you guys enjoyed this live stream or podcast, however you're consuming this video, and really enjoy talking about practicing for tournaments, and was able to pick Randy's brain a lot, and I was learning a lot as well throughout the stream, so really enjoyed that. And I'm excited to continue to make more live streams going forward, more podcasts. And one thing that I want to shout out from my Patreon members, I will be making the Patreon exclusive video this week for the month of May, and I'm a little bit behind on the area breakdown just because I didn't fish very much in April and May because I was getting married and moving into a new house, building a house, stuff like that. So I didn't have that many spots to share with you guys, so I'm kind of stockpiling them up for a month or so. So I'll get those out to you guys. And then also I will be posting the live stream topics on Patreon as well going forward. Apologize for the kind of lack of consistency on Patreon. Again, with marriage, moving into a new house, I'm literally just trying to make sure I have enough time to make a YouTube video, do my business, and not unpack. You can still see my office is still not unpacked. On my studio setup, it is a nightmare in here. So slowly but surely, we're getting this done. I've been told by everyone that it takes a long time to unpack a house, and I'm understanding what they mean. But other than that, Randy, thanks so much for joining me again, and you'll be on for streams for the foreseeable future. Is that correct?
Yeah, sounds great, man.
Awesome, cool. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the stream, and thanks again, Randy. Any last comments before we go?
No, just thanks to everybody. Appreciate you tuning in. It means a lot to us that you spend some time and listen to us. And, we invite you to come back every week and just shoot your comments to us on our social media, mine or Johnny's. Drop a comment. You got any questions, anything we can help you out with, that's what we're here for.
Sounds awesome. Well, again, thanks, Randy, and thanks everyone who tuned in. And we'll see you guys next week for our Fish Moment live stream. Have a great night. Oh, and thank you, Mark, for the $1.99 super chat. It says, great live stream, Johnny and Randy. Sneaking it in there. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, guys.